Welcome to this lecture on social change. Even though we've sketched in a fairly comprehensive view of society so far in the course, we've essentially been examining freeze frames, whether the question at hand is culture, gender, or inequality. The topic of social change puts everything in motion by bringing in social dynamics. So, the purpose of this lecture is first of all to introduce social change, secondly, to survey how sociologists conceptualize it, and thirdly, to introduce the concept of collective action. We can begin by defining social change as any lasting transformation of a society's culture, social institutions, or public policy. If that sounds abstract, it is, because definitions like these, by themselves, are only lifeless categories. From the point of view of people actually caught up in social change, adapting to it, promoting it, resisting it, denying it, things are considerably messier. These are the words of a small-scale hand producer of woolen cloth in 1802. At a point when the introduction of manufactured textiles was threatening not just the livelihood, but the very survival of him, his cohorts, and their families. Back in the day, those who violently opposed mechanization came to be called the Luddites, after their leader Ned Ludd. Today, we would probably call them terrorists, because their response to this social change was to smash the machinery that was its leading edge. What the Luddites realized only too well was one of the fundamental truths about social change, that it is almost never neutral. Some are winners, like the capitalists who built the factories, and others are losers. Clearly, in this case, the English working-class wool croppers. Flash forward to the present and half a world away. The recent construction of the Three Gorges Dam on the Yangtze River in China. It is the world's largest hydroelectric station, and it is helping China power its exponential growth. But it has also displaced 1.3 million people and caused significant ecological damage. There are other characteristics of social change to bear in mind. One is that we need to avoid the tendency to assume that social change happens only once in a while. Some types of societies may change much more slowly than others, and some forms of social change are imperceptible, but change itself is a constant. Another is that social change can be caused by many different factors. Demographics, for instance. Right now, our own society is in the midst of a major change due to the aging of the baby boomers, something we have already talked about. Environmental factors can also drive social change, as we are beginning to realize in this era of human-caused climate change. And of course, technology is a major catalyst for social change. A final characteristic of social change that we want to mention here is that it is unpredictable. Some social change can be planned, much is not, and the consequences can be entirely unintended. When Scottish engineer James Watt came up with an improved design for the steam engine in 1776, he had no idea that it would be one of the driving forces behind the Industrial Revolution, since its original purpose was simply to pump water out of coal mines and not to power factory machinery. Historically speaking, the very foundations of sociology can be found in early attempts to understand the rapid and sometimes calamitous social changes that accompanied the Industrial Revolution, not the least of which were rapid urbanization and social stratification. Here, we are going to categorize theories of social change into three groups: evolutionary models, those based on assumptions about equilibrium, and finally, conflict theory. The common ground of all evolutionary theories is the assumption that societies follow some kind of necessary rules as they change over time, usually along the lines of a progression from worse to better. For the early sociologist Auguste Comte, the task of the social scientist was to discover the laws that governed the inevitable march of societies toward higher states of civilization. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution in the natural world found a new home in the doctrine of social Darwinism. According to social Darwinism, societies evolve from simple to more complex, and that only the strongest societies would succeed because of their superior adaptation to the conditions of living in the modern world. Speaking of modern, these ideas took on even more currency in modernist thinking, which equates change with progress. Now, the sense of optimism that pervades evolutionary theories is tangible, particularly those of a modernist slant. From a more critical perspective, it isn't too difficult to tease out the Eurocentrism of much of this thinking, especially since it became an important part of the rationale for imperial powers to colonize and exploit those they saw as needing to be civilized. A recent echo of this civilizing urge was the case of John Allen Chau. This was the American missionary who thought he could save an indigenous group on a remote island by bringing them Christianity. They didn't wish to be saved, however, and he was killed for his efforts. In the years immediately following the end of the Second World War, some American sociologists began to look at social change not as a necessary progression so much as a temporary response to forces that threatened to destabilize society. For functionalists such as Talcott Parsons, the ideal state of a modern, complex society is an equilibrium. And social change occurs when there are conflicts that need to be resolved between different components of the social system. In any case, the stability of the equilibrium is the key. The third of our models of social change is conflict theory, which, as you know by now, provides a close analysis of the dynamic forces within society that are continually at work. First among those for Karl Marx are social class divisions and the historical process which, in his schematic, would inevitably result in socialism superseding capitalism. And here we note something interesting, which is that even conflict theory contains within some of the assumptions of evolutionary models, notably the idea of an inevitable historical process working itself out through social change. Even though the Marxist predictions of a post-capitalist utopia have not been borne out, the strength of modern conflict theory remains the emphasis on societies as dynamic, ever-changing, rather than static. All of this brings us to the concept of collective action. Any instance in which groups of people engage in some kind of behavior that is focused on bringing about or resisting change. It could be the embattled and starving wool croppers who were driven to destroy factory machinery, or disgruntled hockey fans in Vancouver that you see here. In either case, something has catalyzed people to act together. Early attempts to understand collective action were flawed by an assumption that people simply behaved irrationally in mobs, what was often referred to as the madness of the crowd. Contemporary sociologists have come to understand more objectively the rationality of collective behavior and that is something we'll take up in the seminar. Thanks for checking out this lecture.